You're not here by chance. Something subtle yet insistent has carried you into this moment, into these words, as though history itself has conspired to bring you here. For thousands of years, people across cultures have believed that such meetings are not accidents but signs, omens, whispers of fate. In ancient Greece, they would have called it kairos, the appointed time when events align. In the East, Taoist sages believed in the flow of the Tao, where every step, even the silent ones, carries purpose. And today, you feel that same quiet pull. You are not lost, you are being summoned. And what you are about to encounter is not a grand revelation announced with trumpets or the crashing of thunder. True transformation does not arrive with fireworks, banners, or declarations. It does not demand applause. It comes gently, almost imperceptibly, like the shifting of seasons, like the way dawn arrives before anyone has noticed the night has ended. It is a journey that begins in silence, deep inside, a journey not of becoming someone new, but of remembering who you have always been. This is not the path of spectacle. It is the path of whispers. Think of the ancient initiations of tribes and civilizations. Young men and women were often led into the wilderness, separated from their families, stripped of their comforts, and plunged into silence. There were no witnesses, no crowds, no celebratory feasts at the moment of awakening. Their transformation happened in the dark of the forest, in the stillness of caves, in the solitude of their own hearts. And when they returned, they carried something intangible, an invisible shift that could not be denied. What you are walking into now is not so different. You are stepping into your own wilderness, and the silence around you will teach more than the noise ever could. Carl Jung, who spent his life mapping the hidden landscapes of the human soul, once said that true spiritual growth does not come from perfecting your personality. It comes from transcending it. Imagine shedding layers of armor you once thought were skin. The roles you played, the masks you wore, the identities you clung to, they were never truly you. They were tools, survival mechanisms, illusions built to face the world. And now, quietly, they begin to fall away. What remains is not emptiness, but essence. The essence that has been waiting beneath it all, steady and unwavering. You may have already felt the first signs of this shift without knowing what they were. One morning, you wake and realize that the stories you used to tell about yourself no longer fit. The labels you wore, like badges of honor or chains of shame, have lost their weight. The conversations that once felt vital now sound hollow. Even the spaces you once longed to belong to begin to feel foreign. This quiet estrangement is not a crisis. It is a birth. It is your soul stretching against the boundaries of the old self, and it doesn't roar. It does not announce itself with certainty. Instead, it whispers. It feels like walking into a familiar room and realizing it is no longer home. Like watching the flickering of an old film. You can remember every scene, but it no longer defines you. This distance from your old identity is the first taste of freedom, though it may arrive disguised as disorientation. Cultures throughout history have recognized this disorientation as sacred. The mystics of Sufism called it fana, the dissolution of the self, where the identity dissolves into something greater. Buddhist monks spoke of the little death of the ego as a step toward enlightenment. Even medieval Christian mystics wrote of the dark night of the soul, a place where the old self crumbles, making space for a deeper truth to emerge. Though their languages and rituals differed, they all described the same invisible moment you are now facing, the old world slipping away, and the new one quietly taking shape within. Perhaps this is why transformation so often goes unnoticed by the crowd. It is not the kind of story that makes headlines or legends in its first breath. It begins quietly, with small refusals. The refusal to cling, the refusal to perform, the refusal to keep carrying what has already turned to ash. It begins when you no longer respond the way you used to, when you find yourself holding silence instead of defending your worth, when you realize that your inner stillness is stronger than the chaos outside, that is the whisper of transformation. That is the sign you have already begun. And if you are listening closely now, you can feel it. Not as a concept, not as something distant, but as a presence, a rhythm, a pulse beneath your skin. Something in you knows. Something in you remembers. You are not chasing the person you want to become. You are uncovering the person you have always been. And though the world may not notice, though no ceremony may mark this beginning, history itself tells us that the quietest shifts often lead to the most profound revolutions. The first thing you begin to notice in this journey is how the old self slowly loosens its grip. At first, it feels unsettling. Like removing clothes you have worn for so long, they became part of your skin. But this disrobing of identity is not loss, it is liberation. For years, you may have carried labels: the achiever, the failure, the loyal one, the outcast. These were stories you told yourself, characters you stepped into. And though they once served a purpose, now they feel heavy, ill-fitting, unnecessary. What is falling away is not you. It is everything that was never truly yours. Carl Jung once said that spiritual growth does not come from perfecting the personality, but from transcending it. That single line carries within it the essence of countless traditions. Think of the ancient theater of Greece and Rome. Actors wore masks, the persona, to embody their roles. Yet everyone knew the mask was not the actor. In time, the audience forgot the man behind it, believing only in the mask. This is what we do with ourselves. We confuse the role with the soul. Transcendence begins when we dare to remove the mask, when we see the face beneath it without shame. Cultures across the world have rituals built on this very truth. Among Native American tribes, the vision quest stripped a young person of their social role and placed them alone in nature, fasting, waiting for a dream. In Africa, among the Maasai, boys underwent rites of passage that required them to abandon childhood identities in order to be welcomed as men. Even in medieval Europe, knighthood was preceded by the vigil of arms, where the initiate spent a night in silence, leaving behind his former self. Always there was shedding. Always there was a symbolic death before rebirth. And what you are experiencing now is your own rite of passage, though it may have no ceremony, no witnesses, no name. The old self clings hardest when it senses it is being dissolved. You may feel echoes of fear, a whisper that says, "Without these identities, who am I?" But notice the tone of that voice. It does not come from your essence. It comes from the mask itself, frightened of being taken off. Like armor rusted to the body, it resists removal. Yet once it is gone, you breathe more freely. The air is lighter. You are lighter. Consider how many of your choices once arose from this false identity. You stayed in conversations that drained you, not because they nourished you, but because they confirmed who you thought you had to be. You carried burdens, not because you wanted to, but because you believed they defined your worth. You performed in roles that suffocated you, all to maintain an image, a mask. But when you begin to let go, the script collapses. The stage clears. And you realize that your essence never needed to perform to be real. The shedding of identity is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible. It feels like no longer needing to explain yourself when questioned, like no longer defending choices that are simply yours to make. It is the calm awareness that you are not obligated to wear yesterday's mask just to make today easier. The Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. Much of that waste is in playing characters we were never meant to play. When you stop, you begin to live. And here is the paradox. The more identities you release, the more yourself you become. Not emptier, but fuller. Not undefined, but clearer. It is as though each role you remove makes the outline of your true self more visible. A self that doesn't need labels, doesn't need applause, doesn't need justification. A self that simply is. When you live from this place, choices arise naturally. You no longer calculate how to protect an image. You act because your essence compels you. And in that authenticity lies a freedom no mask could ever offer. This is why the ancients spoke of transformation as a rebirth, not because something new was created, but because something false was stripped away. The phoenix, that mythical bird, does not fear the fire, because it knows it is not the flames that destroy. It is the flames that reveal. The same is true for you. What feels like burning is only the mask turning to ash. What remains is what has always been eternal. So if you feel the tremors of fear, if the voice of the old self protests, remember this: you are not losing yourself. You are meeting yourself for the first time. There comes a moment in this quiet transformation when the past, once heavy as stone, becomes light as smoke. You begin to see it not as a prison, but as a gallery, a place you can visit but no longer inhabit. The story you once repeated like a mantra, the one that defined who you thought you were, now feels distant. You can recall it, even describe it, but it no longer commands your breath. It is like watching an old film reel. The characters are familiar, the plot is recognizable, but you no longer feel bound to it. It is simply a story, and you are no longer the character. You are the observer. This is one of the first undeniable signs that the old self has dissolved. Once you may have narrated your life through the lens of wounds and victories. You told people who you were by listing what had hurt you, what you had overcome, what you had achieved. That story gave you shape. But now, when you reach for it, something has changed. The bitterness has faded. The pride feels unnecessary. What remains is calm. The past is not erased, but it no longer bleeds into your present. You can hold it in your hands like an artifact, precious, meaningful, but no longer alive in you. Humanity has always wrestled with the tension between memory and identity. Ancient civilizations built monuments, carved names into stone, and wrote epics to preserve the past. Yet even as they remembered, they understood that memory was not meant to be inhabited forever. The Egyptians buried their dead with treasures, not because they denied death, but because they acknowledged that life had shifted into another form. The Greeks told epic tales of Troy not to relive the war, but to carry its lessons forward. In Japan, the cherry blossom is celebrated each spring, precisely because it reminds people that beauty is fleeting and that clinging to yesterday blinds us to today. Your life mirrors these truths. To cling to the past as identity is to mummify yourself, to live embalmed in what has already ended. To honor the past as memory is to carry its wisdom without its weight. It becomes a teacher, not a master. Notice the subtle difference. When you tell your story from the wound, there is urgency in your voice. You need to be understood, validated, pitied, or admired. But when the wound has closed, you no longer feel the need to explain. Silence is enough. You can say, "Yes, it happened. Yes, it was part of me, but it no longer defines me." That shift is not cold detachment. It is integration. It is the acknowledgement that every chapter had its purpose, but none has the power to imprison you now. Philosophers and mystics across ages have known this liberation. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, reminded himself daily, "The past is gone, the future uncertain. Only the present belongs to you." Buddhist monks teach the same when they say, "The raft is needed to cross the river, but once you have crossed, you do not carry it on your back." Your past was the raft. It brought you here. But to keep carrying it is to miss the freedom of the shore. Think, too, of the stories we inherit as nations and cultures. A people who define themselves only by their wounds risk living forever as victims of history. Yet those who integrate their pain into wisdom rise with resilience. Germany after the ruins of war, South Africa after apartheid, nations that have confronted their shadows. These are collective examples of what you are experiencing personally. The memory is honored, but it no longer dictates the future. Pain becomes part of the tapestry, not the whole cloth. And so it is with you. You are not erasing what has happened. You are simply changing your relationship with it. What was once a scar you pressed on to feel alive becomes a line on your skin you no longer notice. What was once the centerpiece of your identity becomes a quiet chapter in a much larger book. The more you release your grip, the more you realize the past never defined you. It only prepared you. And in that realization, something else is born, a gentleness. The guilt and pride that once weighed on you melt away. You no longer need to glorify what you achieved or justify what you endured. You are free to let it be what it was, the past. Nothing more, nothing less. And in that freedom, a new story begins. Not one written from wounds, but from the truth of who you are now. At some point in this unfolding journey, you begin to notice something extraordinary. The words, gestures, and situations that once pierced you no longer leave a scar. What used to ignite a storm within now passes through like wind across an open field. You feel the tremor of the moment, but it does not control you. This is not numbness. It is clarity. The difference is profound. You are no longer ruled by the echoes of your old self. You are present, awake, and free. Think of the countless times you reacted in ways you later regretted, out of anger, defensiveness, or wounded pride. Those reactions were not born from the present. They were repetitions of old patterns, echoes of unresolved pain. A single word from someone could summon a lifetime of memories. A single silence could feel like abandonment. You were not responding to the moment. You were replaying the past. But when the old self begins to dissolve, those chains weaken. The trigger no longer finds anything to cling to. The arrow still flies, but it no longer strikes the target. This mastery over emotion has been honored in every culture. The Stoic philosophers of Rome and Greece, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, believed that true freedom was not political, but internal. They wrote that no insult, no misfortune, no betrayal could truly harm a person who had trained the mind to remain sovereign. "You may fetter my leg," Epictetus once said, "but my will not even Zeus himself can overpower." To them, emotional independence was the highest form of power, and you are now walking that same path. The samurai of medieval Japan lived by Bushido, the way of the warrior. Trained to face death at any moment, they cultivated a calm so deep that even in battle they sought stillness. Their writings remind us that when the heart is clouded by anger or fear, the blade falters. Only in clarity can action be precise. What you are learning now, this gentle detachment from your old triggers, is the same clarity. It is the discipline of not letting the past dictate the present, of standing firm even when the world attempts to provoke. Monastic traditions echo this wisdom. In deserts, mountains, and cloisters, monks spent lifetimes practicing awareness of thought and emotion. When insulted, they bowed instead of striking back. When mocked, they answered with silence. They were not suppressing emotion, they were discerning it. They asked, "Does this feeling arise from truth or from the old self still clinging to survival?" That same discernment now awakens in you. You do not run from emotion nor drown in it. You let it pass like a cloud across the sky, knowing the sky itself is untouched. This shift is not loud, but it is revolutionary. You may notice it in small ways. The conversation that once filled you with rage now feels trivial. The rejection that once shattered you now feels like redirection. The criticism that once made you shrink now glances off without penetration. What has changed is not the world, it is you. The world still speaks, still provokes, still tests. But your soul no longer lives at the mercy of those tests. And here lies the deeper truth. Freedom from triggers does not mean indifference. You still feel, but you no longer confuse feeling with truth. You recognize that emotions are messengers, not masters. Anger points to an injustice. Fear points to a place where trust is missing. Sadness points to love that mattered. But none of these require you to react blindly. You can listen without obeying, observe without being consumed. This is maturity. This is sovereignty. History shows us again and again that civilizations rise and fall on this principle. Leaders consumed by pride or wrath destroyed kingdoms. Those who governed with restraint built legacies that endured. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire in chaos, yet his meditations reveal a man who never surrendered his inner calm. Gandhi faced violence and humiliation, but wielded non-reaction as his greatest weapon, transforming the course of history. Their strength was not in refusing to feel. It was in refusing to be controlled by what they felt. And now, that strength is awakening in you. The old self once lived in reaction, easily provoked, easily swayed, anchored by wounds that demanded constant attention. But as those wounds integrate, you rise above the turbulence. You do not deny your humanity. You simply no longer hand your freedom over to the ghosts of your past. As the grip of old triggers fades, another, quieter transformation begins. The voice inside your head, the one that once shouted with judgment and fear, softens. Where once you replayed the same stories to justify, to defend, to punish yourself, now there is space. The inner monologue changes. It is no longer the voice of survival, but the voice of essence. And with that shift, you discover that your thoughts are no longer a prison. They are a compass. For much of life, your mind was a courtroom. Every action stood trial. Every mistake was replayed as evidence of guilt. You rehearsed explanations in case others questioned you. You sought redemption for being who you were. And yet, beneath that noise, something quieter waited. Something that did not argue, did not condemn, did not demand. Now, at last, that voice rises. It does not speak in sentences. It speaks in knowing. You simply observe and move forward. It feels less like thinking and more like remembering something you had forgotten. This is the point where many cultures spoke of rebirth. The Egyptians told of Osiris, dismembered and reassembled, not as the same man, but as something greater, a ruler of the underworld. The Greeks sang of Persephone, who descended into darkness and returned transformed, marking the cycles of life itself. In Hindu tradition, Shiva's dance of destruction was never meant to end the world, but to prepare it for renewal. And in Christianity, baptism is not just cleansing, it is death to the old, birth to the new. Across civilizations, the narrative is the same. You cannot step into the new until you release the old story. Perhaps this is why the image of the phoenix persists across cultures. To see the bird consumed by flames is terrifying until you realize that fire is not its end, but its womb. From ashes rises not a stranger, but the same essence renewed. Your inner narrative undergoes the same fire. The thoughts that once whispered, "I cannot change," "This is just who I am," or "I will always carry this weight," begin to dissolve. Not because you argued with them, but because they no longer make sense to the one you are becoming. The flame of awareness burns away their logic. What emerges is lighter, freer, and true. Anthropologists studying initiation rites often note a peculiar detail. After the ritual, the initiate is never allowed to retell their life the same way. They are given a new name, a new role, a new narrative. The old one is buried with ceremony. Why? Because to keep repeating the old story would drag the new self back into old patterns. The ritual forced the community to honor the change. And though you may not have such a community around you now, The same law applies. You do not need to keep explaining yourself through the story of wounds or victories. You are not your resume of pain and pride. You are the presence that observes both and moves forward. This shift is not always comfortable. At first, silence feels strange. You notice that you no longer want to justify your past to others. You no longer crave the same validation. You may even feel a sense of emptiness, as though without your story, you have lost your shape. But that emptiness is fertile. It is the soil from which something authentic grows. You are no longer a character reciting old lines. You are the author holding the pen, ready to write without chains. It is here that freedom deepens. The old inner narrative, built on guilt, pride, and survival, collapses. In its place emerges something subtler, something closer to truth. Not a new script, but an inner stillness that no longer needs a script at all. You realize that every chapter of your past, whether glorious or painful, was necessary to bring you here, and yet you no longer need to replay it. Its purpose is fulfilled. Its role complete. From this silence, new choices arise. Not the frantic choices of fear, nor the desperate choices of proving yourself, but choices born of alignment, choices that do not demand applause, choices that simply feel right. And as these choices accumulate, your life begins to tell a different story. Not the story of survival, but the story of presence. Not the story of wounds, but the story of essence. A story not written for others, but lived for yourself. When your inner world transforms, your outer world cannot remain the same. The relationships you once clung to, the dynamics you once tolerated, begin to shift. This is not because you suddenly reject others, but because you are no longer vibrating at the same frequency. Where once you sought validation, now you seek presence. Where once you bargained with affection to avoid loneliness, now you no longer need to. This change is subtle, yet radical. It reshapes the entire way you relate to others. In the past, your relationships may have been forged out of need. You sought saviors in lovers, proof of worth in friends, mirrors of identity in family. You leaned on others to fill the voids you were too afraid to face within yourself. And they, in turn, leaned on your unhealed parts to fill theirs. So many of our human bonds are unconscious trades. I will carry your pain if you carry mine. I will confirm your identity if you confirm mine. But when you begin to transcend your old self, those trades dissolve. You no longer barter with your soul. You no longer offer presence as currency. You begin to connect from a place of fullness, not lack. This has been known since ancient times. Confucius taught that true harmony in society begins with harmony in the self. The gentleman, he said, seeks harmony, not conformity. Harmony is not clinging to others out of fear. It is standing in your center so firmly that you can meet others without distortion. The medieval codes of chivalry carried echoes of this. A knight's honor was not measured by conquest alone, but by his ability to serve without need, to act from principle rather than pride. In every culture, the message is the same. When the self is whole, relationships become genuine. You may notice that as this shift happens, certain bonds fall away. Friends with whom you once shared endless conversations may now feel like strangers. Their words echo, but no longer resonate. This is not betrayal. It is alignment. Your silence is no longer something you fear, so you no longer need chatter to escape it. Your solitude has become fertile, so you no longer accept companionship that drains it. What stays in your life does so not out of habit, but out of truth. And yet, this change does not make you colder. On the contrary, it makes you warmer. Because when you give now, it is not from emptiness, but from balance. You no longer offer love as a bargain for safety. You offer it as an overflow of presence. You no longer demand that others complete you. You invite them to share in your wholeness. The love that emerges from this state is quieter, deeper, steadier. It does not scream through promises or beg to be seen. It simply is. Like a river that does not need to announce its flow, it nourishes silently. Consider the way relationships functioned in ancient communities. Bonds were not just emotional, they were survival. Villages thrived when cooperation was authentic, when each person contributed from their gifts. But when greed or fear corrupted the bond, communities fractured. The same is true in the microcosm of your life. When relationships are built on truth, they sustain you. When they are built on need, they exhaust you. Your new self no longer accepts exhaustion disguised as love. This does not mean conflict vanishes. It means conflict is no longer catastrophic. If someone misunderstands you, you do not crumble. If someone leaves, you do not collapse. Because your peace is not in their hands anymore. Your center no longer wavers when others withdraw their presence. You remain. And in remaining, you discover that the true test of any bond is not how loudly it claims permanence, but how silently it endures alignment. Even history's great reformers understood this. Gandhi's nonviolence was not passivity. It was a radical act of self-mastery. He related to his oppressors not from wounds, but from presence. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed the same when he said, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." Both knew that to relate from wounds is to repeat cycles of oppression, but to relate from presence is to transform them. And so with you, your relationships now become reflections of your wholeness, not bandages for your fractures. In this state, you no longer confuse intensity with truth or drama with depth. You recognize that what brings peace is what truly has roots. Relationships that require constant tension to survive are masks for disconnection. Those that expand you, that allow you to rest fully in yourself, are the ones that endure. You stop forcing bonds that do not align, and in doing so, you invite those that do. What remains is honest, balanced, and real. At first, silence feels like emptiness. It feels like the absence of company, of sound, of validation. But when the old self dissolves, silence begins to reveal itself as something else entirely. It is no longer a void. It is a sanctuary. What once terrified you now strengthens you. You learn to sit with yourself not as punishment, but as presence. And in that presence, you discover a power that noise could never give. In your old story, silence was something to be avoided. You filled it with conversations, distractions, relationships, and rituals of busyness. You feared that if you sat too long in the quiet, the truth of your wounds would echo too loudly. But now the silence no longer frightens you. It becomes a mirror, showing you not your pain, but your essence. You realize that solitude is not loneliness, it is communion with yourself. Mystics have always known this. The desert fathers of early Christianity wandered into barren landscapes, seeking nothing but silence. Alone among the sands, they found that silence stripped away the illusions of the world and forced them to meet themselves. Buddhist monks in the Himalayas retreated into caves, not because they rejected the world, but because they sought to hear the whispers beneath it. Sufi poets like Rumi and Hafiz spoke of silence as the language of the soul, where words end and truth begins. Each tradition, though scattered across centuries and continents, discovered the same secret. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strength distilled. You may begin to notice how silence changes your relationships. Where once you needed to fill every gap in conversation, now you can sit in quiet without unease. Where once you chased constant affirmation, now you feel no urge to explain. Silence becomes your boundary. It shields you without walls. It protects you without conflict. Others may demand reasons for your choices, but you no longer feel compelled to justify. Your silence speaks for itself, and in that you are free. This is not the silence of suppression. It is not the silence of the unheard or the silenced. It is the silence of integration, the kind that carries dignity, the kind that speaks louder than words. History remembers leaders who understood this power. Think of Nelson Mandela, who endured decades of imprisonment. His silence was not defeat. It was preparation. When he emerged, his quiet dignity carried more force than any speech of anger could have. Or consider the samurai before battle, meditating in stillness, their silence sharper than their blades. Power, they knew, was not in noise but in restraint. You begin to notice that the more you embrace silence, the less others can manipulate you. Insults lose their sting when you do not echo them back. Manipulation fails when you do not rush to defend yourself. The old self once filled silence with explanation and apology. The new self allows silence to breathe, knowing that truth requires no defense. In this, silence becomes not absence but presence, an invisible armor that no weapon can pierce. And there is something else silence gives you: vision. In the quiet, without the constant noise of external validation, you begin to hear what you had always missed, the voice of your own soul. Its guidance is subtle, a nudge, a knowing, a pull in a direction you may not have considered. When you give it space, clarity emerges. Decisions once clouded by doubt begin to feel simple. Paths once tangled in fear begin to unfold. You realize that the world does not speak most clearly through noise, but through stillness. Poets have called this the music of silence, the song only the soul can hear. When you walk in nature and the air feels alive, when you pause in the middle of chaos and suddenly sense calm, when you sit in solitude and realize you are not alone, this is silence speaking. It does not demand. It does not shout. It reminds you, gently but firmly, that presence itself is power. And so you stop fearing silence. You stop filling it with noise. You welcome it, guard it, honor it. Because in silence, you are no longer scattered. You are whole. You are no longer searching. You have arrived. There is a threshold on this path that few dare to cross. It is the moment you turn inward, not to seek light, but to face the darkness you have long avoided. For most, the shadow is terrifying. It contains all that has been denied: anger, shame, fear, memories buried because they were too heavy to carry. Yet Carl Jung reminded us that enlightenment does not come from imagining figures of light, but from making the darkness conscious. Transformation demands that you walk into this hidden territory, not to destroy it, but to meet it, to acknowledge it as part of you. Think of the myths humanity has told about such journeys. In Greek legend, Orpheus descended into the underworld, not to conquer it, but to bring back truth. Persephone was taken into Hades, and in her return, the seasons themselves were born. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the poet must walk through hell before he can glimpse paradise. Again and again, cultures taught that descent into darkness was not failure, it was initiation. The shadow is not a prison, it is a passage. Shamans in indigenous traditions understood this deeply. Initiates were often sent into trance, confronting terrifying visions. They did not fight these images, they welcomed them. By integrating their fears, they returned with wisdom not only for themselves, but for their communities. The shadow, once befriended, became a source of medicine, and so it is for you. The parts of yourself you tried hardest to suppress, the anger you were taught to hide, the grief you were told to silence, the fear you pretended not to feel. These are not enemies. They are teachers waiting for your recognition. At first it may feel unbearable. You look at memories you thought were long dead and realize they still pulse. You acknowledge impulses you swore were not yours. You see the masks you wore not as lies, but as desperate protections. This confrontation strips away every excuse, yet within that rawness lies liberation. Because when you see your shadow clearly, it no longer controls you in silence. What once manipulated your choices from the dark now stands in the light, visible, nameable, manageable. You are no longer haunted, you are informed. Consider how many people live in denial of this process. They run from their pain, projecting it onto others, blaming the world for wounds they refuse to face. Whole nations have done the same, repeating cycles of violence because they never integrated the shadows of their past. But those who dare to confront it, whether individuals or societies, emerge with a clarity that denial can never give. Germany confronting its history, South Africa facing apartheid, Rwanda facing its genocide. Painful, yes, but necessary. Healing comes only when the shadow is seen, spoken, and honored as part of the whole. Your personal shadow is no different. To embrace it is to find wisdom where once there was only fear. Anger becomes a compass, pointing to where boundaries were crossed. Fear becomes a guide, showing where trust must be built. Grief becomes proof of love, evidence of how deeply you have cared. What once felt like poison transforms into medicine. The very parts you thought made you broken reveal themselves as sources of strength. This is why shadow work has always been described in paradox. To descend is to rise. To face death is to discover life. To admit weakness is to uncover strength. The hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell described it, is always the same. The hero must enter the cave he fears most, because within it lies the treasure he seeks. And you, in this very moment, are living that story. Your treasure is not found by avoiding the shadow. It is found by walking into it with open eyes. And so you stop running. You take your shadow by the hand and say, I see you. You are part of me. That act of courage changes everything. You no longer need to defend against your own darkness, nor project it onto others. You integrate it. You allow it to live within you, not as an enemy, but as a companion. And in doing so, you become whole. When you emerge from the shadow, the world itself begins to look different. The same streets, the same faces, the same daily routines remain, but your vision has shifted. Where once you saw chaos, you now sense hidden order. Where once you felt trapped by time, you now experience rhythm. Life does not change on the surface. You change at the root. And in that shift, the ordinary becomes sacred. The past no longer chains you, and the future no longer terrifies you. You begin to live in harmony with the present, not as a fleeting second between what was and what will be, but as eternity itself. This is not a new idea. It is an ancient remembering. The Native American Lakota people spoke of time not as a line, but as a circle, a great hoop where every moment touches every other. In this circle, there is no rushing, no desperation, only rhythm. To live in alignment with that rhythm is to understand that life does not hurry, but flows. And you too begin to flow. Your priorities rearrange themselves. What once seemed urgent begins to fade. The endless race to prove yourself, to achieve more, to be seen, loses its grip. In its place, small things grow luminous. A pause between words, the warmth of sunlight on your face, the breath that enters and leaves your body without demand. These are no longer overlooked details. They become the true wealth of your days. This is what the Renaissance humanists meant when they spoke of dignity, not glory in monuments or power, but the simple grace of being alive and aware. Even science has whispered this truth. Albert Einstein once remarked that time is an illusion, that past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Though physics framed it in mathematics, the soul has always known it experientially. When you release the grip of the old self, you stop living in frantic resistance to time. You no longer chase what is slipping away, nor do you cling to what has already gone. You begin to trust the unfolding, even if you do not understand every step. This trust is not naivety. It is maturity. It is a recognition that life, like a symphony, is beautiful not because we control each note, but because we surrender to the music. Challenges, too, are no longer enemies. Where once you saw obstacles designed to break you, you now see thresholds meant to awaken you. The old self interpreted difficulty as punishment. The new self understands it as passage. Just as initiation rituals demanded ordeal before transformation, your soul recognizes hardship as the fire that tempers steel. You stop asking, "Why me?" and begin to ask, "What is this shaping in me?" And in that question, the pain itself begins to shift into purpose. Cultures across the world honored this principle. In African traditions, suffering was often seen as a sacred teacher, preparing the soul for wisdom. In Buddhism, life's inevitable suffering, dukkha, was not a curse but the starting point for liberation. Even in the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, exile and fracture were understood as preludes to restoration and light. Humanity has always known difficulty is not an interruption of life's path, it is part of the path itself. And when your perception changes, even struggle becomes holy. This is the profound change. You stop measuring life by what it gives or takes. You begin to measure it by how deeply you can be present within it. A long silence with yourself feels more nourishing than 1,000 empty distractions. A single conversation held in truth feels more valuable than years of shallow exchanges. You no longer chase intensity for its own sake, because you know that what is real is rarely loud. It is steady. It is calm. It endures. And as this new vision settles, you realize that nothing external has changed, and yet everything has. You are no longer surviving life. You are inhabiting it. Each day no longer feels like something to get through, but something to awaken within. And this awakening is not fleeting. Once you see the hidden order, once you live by this rhythm, you cannot go back. The lens through which you view life has changed forever. There is no trumpet, no crown, no moment when the world announces that you have transcended your old self. The shift is so quiet that you may not even notice when it happens. One day you simply realize you do not react the way you once did. The things that once hurt you now barely graze your skin. The urgency that once propelled your every choice has dissolved. You move differently, calmer, clearer, freer. The transformation was never about spectacle. It was about alignment. And now you embody it. This embodiment is not about creating a new identity. It is not about proving that you have changed. It is about no longer needing to. Your presence itself becomes the proof. You walk into a room and bring stillness where once you carried tension. You sit in silence without reaching for distraction. You choose peace without needing others to approve of it. This is not a role you play. It is who you are, lived without apology. History remembers such presences. The Buddha did not shout his awakening. He sat beneath a tree, still and rooted, and his silence changed the world. Francis of Assisi walked barefoot, radiating humility, and even animals seemed drawn to his presence. Teresa of Avila, cloistered in her convent, spoke words that still ignite souls centuries later. These figures did not seek to impress. They embodied. And embodiment, quiet as it may be, carries farther than noise ever can. You begin to understand that your life itself is now the teaching. Without trying, you become a mirror for others. Some will feel drawn to your steadiness, sensing in you a truth they have not yet claimed. Others may resist, unsettled by a calm they cannot yet touch. But you are no longer swayed by either. You do not cling to those who stay, nor grieve those who leave. Your center defines your relationships, not the other way around. And from this place, only what truly resonates can remain. This is where love itself transforms. It is no longer a bargain, a plea, or a desperate reaching. It is not about completing or saving. It becomes a quiet sharing, a reflection of wholeness. Real love does not demand to be seen or proven. It is steady, congruent, and free of chains. It does not cling, but it endures. It does not wound, but it expands. From your presence flows a love that does not weaken you, but strengthens all who touch it. You also begin to see challenges differently. They do not vanish, but they no longer define you. A difficulty may arise, but you no longer collapse beneath it. Instead, you face it as a threshold, a call to live even more deeply in alignment. Your vibration no longer emits fear or urgency. It radiates truth. And that truth speaks more loudly than any explanation ever could. It speaks in your eyes, in your stillness, in the way you walk away from what no longer nourishes you without leaving resentment behind. This is sovereignty, not control over the world, but mastery over yourself. And perhaps the most profound change is your relationship with life itself. No longer a race, it becomes a sacred unfolding. Each moment feels less like something to conquer and more like something to receive. Gratitude replaces striving. Curiosity replaces fear. Presence replaces resistance. You no longer demand that life bend to your will. You walk with it, aligned, trusting its rhythm. What is meant for you stays. What is not fades away without drama, and in both you remain at peace. This is what it means to embody the transcendent self, not to become untouchable, but to become fully human, not to escape life, but to inhabit it with depth, not to shine with noise, but to radiate with quiet truth. You are no longer hiding behind masks, no longer chained by old narratives, no longer enslaved by triggers. You are free, not because the world has changed, but because you have. And from this space, you finally see the essence of transformation. It was never about becoming someone else. It was about remembering who you already were. Beneath the noise, beneath the wounds, beneath the masks, this self was always waiting. Patient, unwavering, eternal. And now you live it. Without need for recognition, without demand for applause, you embody the truth of your soul. And so the journey that began with a whisper ends with a presence, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. You have not escaped your life. You have reclaimed it. And in doing so, you have discovered the most profound freedom of all, to simply be fully, truly, and quietly yourself.